The first time I saw them, I thought they were just lost. Two men in dark uniforms, leaning against a black and white cruiser, parked crooked on the gravel shoulder of my driveway. The kind of car you'd expect in a small-town patrol, except the decals didn't look quite right, and the flashing lights were a shade off, cheap plastic red and blue that didn't glow so much as flicker. I'd been through enough HOA drama by then to know that nothing around this lake happened without a reason. For months, they'd been trying to push me into joining the community, as if signing my name on a sheet of paper would magically make them my overlords. They wanted dues. They wanted authority. They wanted control. And they hated that. I wouldn't play their game. But that morning was different. When I stepped out onto my porch, coffee in hand, I noticed the way they were watching me. Not just casual glances, but a quiet, sharp kind of stare. They didn't wave. They didn't smile. They just stood there, arms folded, as if their presence alone was supposed to make me nervous. At first, I let it slide. People passed through, all the time, and I wasn't in the mood to feed their curiosity. But when I walked down toward the gate, I caught the logo stenciled onto their sleeves, a gold badge shape with the words Community Enforcement Division. That was the moment the pieces started falling into place. This wasn't law enforcement. This was the HOA, playing dress-up. The board had been escalating for weeks. First, it was the letters, formal warnings for non-compliance, with rules that didn't apply to my land. Then came the fake fines, hand-delivered to my mailbox, with bright red stamps designed to look official. And now, apparently, they'd decided the next logical step was to send a couple of rent-a-cops with shiny badges and empty threats. I didn't engage. I didn't have to. Because while they loitered at my gate, trying to look intimidating, I walked straight to the spot where my property markers sat. Iron stakes buried deep in the soil, placed there decades before their little community even existed. And that's when I realized something they clearly hadn't bothered to check. Their so-called Community Enforcement Office, the very building where they held their meetings, printed their phony violation slips, and plotted their next moves, was sitting on land that still belonged to me. I'd known the boundary lines for years, memorized every curve of the survey maps my grandfather had kept in his workshop. But I'd never had a reason to think about that little patch of gravel on the edge of the road, the one they'd paved over and turned into their administrative hub, until that morning. And suddenly, every smug letter, every fake fine, every time they'd tried to humiliate me in front of the neighbors, every bit of it had a new weight. Because now, the game had changed. I didn't call them out. Not yet. I let them play their part. Let them file their empty reports and take their staged photos. Let them believe they were the ones in control. But behind the quiet, I was already working. I dug out the old deeds, the original surveys with my families, name inked in the margins. I called my attorney, a man who had been through more of these HOA wars than anyone I knew, and handed him the file with a single sentence. I think they've built on my land. The look on his face told me everything. The HOA thought they were turning up the pressure, trying to break me into compliance with cheap intimidation tactics. What they didn't know was that they'd just handed me the one piece of leverage they could never undo. And as I sat on the porch that evening, the sun dropping behind the pines and the lake turning to gold, I felt something I hadn't in months. Calm. Because, for the first time since this whole war had started, the balance of power had shifted, and they didn't even know it yet. The next week, the fake cops came back. They parked in the same spot near my gate, leaned against their car, and made a show of scribbling notes on cheap clipboards. This time, they even walked the perimeter of my property like they were doing some official inspection. The neighbors, curious as ever, slowed their cars as they passed, whispering into phones, probably spreading stories about how I was finally in trouble. I let them look. I let them write whatever they wanted in their little pads. I didn't give them the reaction they were hoping for. Because while they were busy pretending to be law enforcement, I was busy with something far more important. Every evening after work, I went through my grandfather's records. Faded surveys, handwritten notes, and stacks of official deeds, some of them nearly a century old. And there it was, clear as day. The parcel of land where the HOA office sat was still legally part of my family's property. Somewhere along the way, during all their expansions and community improvements, they'd just assumed that space was theirs to take. Maybe they thought nobody would notice. Maybe they thought they could bully me into silence if I ever questioned it. But they hadn't counted on me keeping every scrap of paper, every signature, every stamped and notarized page that proved the truth. I drove out to the county clerk's office one afternoon, copies of those documents in hand, and asked them to pull the official maps. When the clerk rolled out the current plat map, there it was again, in black and white, that rectangle of land, clearly marked under my name. The clerk gave me a look I'll never forget, a quiet mix of confusion and amusement. "Did you know," she said, "that their office is technically an illegal structure?" I didn't smile. I just thanked her, folded the documents back into their envelope, and drove home with the kind of quiet confidence you only feel when you know the storm is about to break. But on your terms. The HOA kept escalating. First, there were the letters. Bright red stamps across the top. Bold words like "final warning" and "pending action." They fined me for unapproved modifications, for unregistered vehicles, even for failure to maintain landscaping, all on property they had no legal claim over. Then came the threats. Not direct, of course. They couched them in legal jargon, sentences full of words like remediation and compliance, as if dressing up their bullying in formal language would make it legitimate. But the real kicker came one Thursday morning. I woke to the sound of tires on gravel and stepped onto my porch to see a tow truck idling near my driveway. Behind it, those same fake officers, arms crossed, gesturing toward my truck like they were about to have it hauled away. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. Instead, I walked calmly to the edge of my property and pointed to the iron stakes buried in the dirt, the markers that clearly showed where my land began and where their authority ended. They hesitated. One of them muttered something into his radio. Then they all climbed back into their vehicles and left without another word. That was the moment I knew they were nervous, and that nervousness only grew in the weeks that followed. My attorney had filed the first round of paperwork by then, a formal notice of encroachment, a demand for immediate removal of the structure they'd built illegally, and a warning that if they didn't vacate, we'd be seeking damages. I didn't tell anyone. Not the neighbors, not even the few people on the lake who quietly supported me. I didn't need gossip muddying the waters. I wanted this to play out clean, on paper, where their lies couldn't twist the facts. But the HOA must have sensed something, because their behavior started to change. The fake cops stopped showing up as often. The letters slowed to a trickle, and when I passed their office on the way into town, I noticed fewer cars in the lot, fewer people hanging around the front porch like they owned the place. Then, one afternoon, I caught the president herself standing out by the road, phone to, her ear pacing the gravel like a caged animal. She didn't see me, but I saw her. And in that moment, I realized the balance had shifted. They knew. Maybe they hadn't pieced it all together yet, but they knew something was coming. I kept my routine steady. I worked in the shop, I fished on quiet mornings, I walked the property lines like my grandfather had taught me, and all the while my attorney worked behind the scenes, filing motions, pulling permits, building a case so airtight that even the slickest HOA lawyer wouldn't be able to poke a hole in it. The day the certified letter arrived, I didn't even open it. I knew what it said. Another desperate attempt to reassert control. More bluster about rules and fines and community harmony. I left it on the kitchen counter and went back to sanding the rail on my dock. Because the truth was simple. Their office, their meeting place, their little symbol of authority, it was mine. And soon, everyone was going to know it. The neighbors would hear it first. Whispered over coffee and echoed at the marina. Then it would spread, fast and sharp, until even the board couldn't ignore it. And when that moment came, I was going to be ready, not with anger, not with shouting, but with calm, deliberate proof. Because in wars like this, the loudest voice doesn't win. The one with the facts does. By the time summer rolled around, the HOA's facade of confidence had started to crumble. The signs were subtle at first. The fake patrol car that used to idle near my driveway every other day suddenly stopped showing up. The constant streams of letters, each stamped with bold red threats, slowed to a trickle. Even the president, who once strutted through the neighborhood like a queen surveying her kingdom, now avoided eye contact whenever our paths crossed. They weren't done, of course. Bullies rarely are. But they were rattled. And rattled people make mistakes. The first crack appeared when they tried to host their monthly community meeting. Normally, these meetings were a spectacle. Neighbors crammed into folding chairs, the board seated at a table up front like royalty, and the aide, President delivering her carefully rehearsed speeches about community values and shared responsibility. But that month, the parking lot was half empty. The residents who did show up were quiet, watchful, whispering to one another as they filed in. I stayed home, of course, but word travels fast around a lake this small. Apparently, the meeting barely lasted 15 minutes before someone finally asked the question the board had been trying to avoid. Is it true the office is on land you don't own? No one on the board had an answer. The second crack came a week later when one of the community enforcement officers, one of the fake cops, quit. Just walked away, uniform and all, and started telling anyone who would listen that he'd been misled. That the board had told him they had authority they didn't, that they'd promised legal backing that never materialized. By the time that story hit the local coffee shop, the board's credibility was in free fall. And still, they didn't stop. Desperation makes people reckless, and the HOA was nothing if not desperate. They doubled down on their intimidation tactics, sending late-night emails filled with veiled threats, dropping official notices in my mailbox stamped with words like urgent action required, and even showing up at the edge of my property with cameras, as if they could document some imaginary violation to use against me. I ignored them all, not because I didn't care, but because I knew the truth. Every stunt they pulled, every fake fine, every empty threat was another piece of evidence in my growing case against them. Meanwhile, my attorney moved quietly, filing motions, compiling documentation, and preparing for the inevitable day when this would end up in court. Every deed, every survey, every photo of the property lines was cataloged and ready, and then came the day the county got involved. It started with a letter, not from the HOA, but from the county zoning office. A formal notification that the Community Enforcement Office had been flagged for a compliance review, triggered by an anonymous tip about improper construction and encroachment. I didn't need to guess who filed that tip. The zoning officer came out a few days later, clipboard in hand, and walked the property line with me. I showed him the markers, the maps, the documents that proved, beyond any doubt, that the office sat squarely on my land. He didn't say much, but the look on his face said plenty. Within a week, the HOA received its first official notice of violation. And just like that, the balance of power shifted completely. The neighbors noticed first. People who used to avoid me out of fear of the board's wrath started stopping by, offering quiet words of support. Some of them shared their own stories, years of petty fines, harassment, and threats. Others admitted they'd always suspected. The board was overstepping but had been too afraid to speak up. Now, though, the fear was gone, because everyone could see it. The board wasn't untouchable anymore. The president tried to rally. She sent out long, rambling emails full of legal jargon and thinly veiled attacks, insisting that the false claims about the office were part of a malicious smear campaign. She even held a hastily arranged town hall, complete, with catered snacks and printed flyers, trying to paint herself as the victim. But it didn't work. People had seen too much. They'd heard the zoning officer's verdict. They'd watched the fake cops disappear. And they'd started asking questions the board couldn't answer. That was when the real panic set in. I saw it in their behavior. Hurried meetings behind, closed doors, frantic phone calls taken in parked cars, board members whispering to each other in the aisles of the local grocery store. And then, one morning, I got the letter that told me everything I needed to know. It wasn't another fake fine or hollow threat. It was an offer, a settlement, they called it. A polite request to resolve the matter amicably, complete with a promise to vacate the office and compensate for any inconvenience caused. I didn't respond, because this was never about a payout. It was about principle, about standing my ground against a group that had spent years trying to bully me and everyone else around this lake into submission. And more than that, it was about accountability, because for years they'd operated like they were above the law, making up rules, handing out punishments, and intimidating anyone who dared to push back. Now, for the first time, they were being forced to answer for it, and I wasn't about to let them wriggle out of it quietly. So I waited. I kept to my routine: coffee on the porch in the mornings, work in the shop during the day, quiet evenings by the water, and all the while, my attorney kept building the case piece by piece until it was airtight. By late summer, the county had issued a formal order. The office had to be vacated and the structure removed within 60 days. Failure to comply would result in fines and possible legal action. When that news hit, the neighborhood buzzed like a hive. Some people cheered quietly, relieved to see the board finally facing consequences. Others, the ones who'd benefited from the board's favoritism, grumbled about outsiders ruining the community. But none of that mattered, because the fact was simple: the land was mine. And soon, the office that had been their symbol of authority, the place where they'd planned every scheme, written every bogus fine, and sent out every threatening letter, was going to be nothing but an empty patch of dirt. And for the first time in a long time, the lake felt quiet. Not the uneasy quiet of tension building, but the calm quiet of change. Because everyone knew what was coming next. And this time, there was nothing the HOA could do to stop it. The county's notice hit the HOA board like a thunderclap. By the following Monday, the once busy office that sat illegally on my land looked like a war room. Cars lined the gravel shoulder. Board members hurried in and out with arms full of paperwork, and the president, still clinging to her carefully pressed purple suits, paced the front porch with her phone pressed tight to her ear. Neighbors noticed. You couldn't miss it. The same people who used to nod politely to the board members at meetings now watched them from across the street, whispering over their mailboxes or shaking their heads when the frantic shouting leaked through the offices. Thin walls. It didn't take long for their panic to spill out into the open. The first sign was the email, a rambling, poorly edited message sent to every homeowner in the community, full of excuses and legal jargon. It claimed the county's order was unfounded, accused hostile elements of spreading lies, and assured everyone that the board was exploring all options to protect community assets. But beneath the bold words, you could feel the desperation. They knew the walls were closing in. Within a week, the HOA president called an emergency meeting at the community center, a last-ditch attempt to rally support. Flyers appeared in mailboxes promising clarity and solutions. Neighbors showed up in droves, packing the room to standing room-only levels, not out of loyalty, but out of curiosity. By all accounts, it was a disaster. The president opened the meeting with her usual confidence, flipping through a stack of notes and talking about misunderstandings and property line disputes. But it didn't take long for the questions to start. Hard, pointed questions from people who had been quiet for too long. How could you not know the land wasn't yours? Why did you send letters threatening people if you had no legal authority? What happened to all the money we've been paying for years? The answers were vague, deflective, and every time the president tried to steer the conversation back to her script, the room grew louder. One neighbor, a man who'd been fined thousands over the years for violations, reportedly stood up and read aloud from the county's order, his voice shaking with anger. Others joined in, demanding financial records, demanding accountability. By the end of the night, the board left in silence, their supporters dwindling to a handful of loyalists who looked as uneasy as everyone else. And just like that, the IUA illusion was gone. The next blow came from the county itself. An inspector returned to the property, this time with a camera crew from the local news station. They documented everything. The office sitting squarely on my land, the haphazard construction that violated half a dozen zoning codes, even the rusted septic system that had been leaking into the soil for years. When that footage aired on the evening news, the story exploded. What had started as a quiet boundary dispute was now a full-blown scandal, the kind that draws attention from every corner of a small community. People who had never paid attention to HOA politics were suddenly calling for resignations, demanding audits, and questioning every decision the board had made in the last decade. And through it all, I stayed quiet. I went about my days like I always had. Mornings on the porch with my coffee, afternoons in the workshop, evenings walking the property lines. My attorney advised me to let the process play out, and that's exactly what I did. But behind the scenes, the legal gears were turning fast. The county issued a final order: vacate the office within 30 days or face daily fines and possible legal action. The board scrambled to file appeals, but their own attorney reportedly warned them they had no case. The land was mine. It always had been. Neighbors told me the tension inside the board meetings was palpable. Arguments broke out. Fingers were pointed, and one by one, board members began to resign. The treasurer was the first to go, quietly slipping his resignation letter under the office door late one night. The secretary followed a week later. By the third week, the enforcement officers were gone, too. Their uniforms returned, their paychecks bouncing as the board's accounts dwindled. And then, on a bright Saturday morning, the final collapse came. I was on my porch when I heard the sound of engines. 2 county trucks pulled up to the illegal office, followed by a flatbed hauling a portable storage container. A team of workers stepped out, clipboards in hand, and began the slow, methodical process of clearing the building. Neighbors gathered along the road, watching in stunned silence as the contents of the office, filing cabinets, office chairs, boxes of records, were carried out and loaded into the container. By afternoon, the building stood empty, and by the following week, it was gone. The county had the structure dismantled, piece by piece, until all that remained was a bare patch of gravel and the faint outline of where the foundation had been. For the first time in years, that corner of my property was quiet. No more cars coming and going at all hours. No more fake patrols idling near my gate. No more board members standing on the porch, plotting their next move. Just silence. And in that silence, something shifted around the lake. People started talking again. Not about fines or violations or threats, but about possibilities. About what it would mean to have a community without fear. About rebuilding, not under the thumb of a power-hungry board, but together, as neighbors. Some of them came to me, cautiously at first, to say thank you. Others apologized for the years they'd stayed silent, for the times they'd looked the other way while the board flexed its power. I didn't hold grudges, because this fight had never been about winning. It had been about standing my ground, about protecting what was mine, and about proving that no amount of intimidation could change the truth. And now, with the office gone and the board in shambles, that truth was undeniable. But even as the dust settled, I knew the story wasn't over. There were still financial records to untangle, still questions about where all the money had gone, still decisions to be made about what would replace the void the HOA had left behind. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew there would always be a risk, that someone, someday, would try to build the same machine again, to claw back control and power. But if that day ever came, they'd find me right where I'd always been, on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the lake, ready to stand my ground all over again. The morning after the illegal office was torn down, the lake was quieter than I'd ever heard it. No cars rumbling up and down the gravel road. No board members barking orders into their phones. No fake patrol vehicles idling by my gate. The only sound was the soft slap of water against the dock and the distant call of loons across the lake. But calm like that doesn't last. Not when there are still questions, big ones, hanging in the air. By Monday, the county released a statement. A full audit of the HOA's financial records was underway. At first, it sounded procedural, like just another layer of bureaucracy. But when the local news station started digging, the truth hit the community like a hammer. Years of dues and fees, hundreds of thousands of dollars, had been funneled through fake contracts, inflated invoices, and shell companies that all traced back to people on the board, landscaping jobs that never happened, repairs that were billed but never completed, even security equipment that had supposedly cost thousands but turned out to be cheap knockoffs ordered online. Neighbors were furious. People who had been fined for leaving a kayak on the dock overnight now realized their money hadn't gone toward community improvements, but to weekend getaways, luxury vehicles, and even a down payment on the president's lakefront cabin. The phones at the Weiss county clerk's office lit up nonstop. Residents wanted answers. Some wanted their money back. Others wanted blood. And through it all, I stayed silent. Not because I didn't care, I did, but because this wasn't my fight anymore. I'd done my part. I'd exposed their lie. Now it was up to the system to deal with the wreckage. The investigators didn't waste time. Within weeks, subpoenas went out. Boxes of documents were seized. Computers from the now demolished office were pulled from the storage unit the county had rented to hold the HOA's records. And then came the arrests. The first was the treasurer, a quiet man who had kept his head down through most of the chaos. People thought he'd been just a bystander, someone who had gone along with the president's schemes out of fear or loyalty. But when the investigators followed the money, his name was on almost every transaction. 2 weeks later, the president herself was led out of her house in handcuffs. It was early morning, the kind of morning where the mist still hung low over the lake. The news crews were there, of course, catching every second as she was walked down her own driveway in the same purple suit jacket she'd worn to so many official meetings. Neighbors watched from their porches. Some looked shocked. Others just looked tired. By the end of the month, 3 more board members had been charged with fraud, conspiracy, and misuse of community funds. For the first time in years, the lake felt free, without the constant fear of fines, threats, and surveillance. People started to breathe again. Kids rode their bikes down the road without parents worrying about violations. Neighbors stopped avoiding one another, started talking again, started remembering what it was like to live in a community instead of under a regime. One Saturday, I watched from my porch as a group of neighbors came together to fix the shared boat ramp. No board approvals, no fines, no arguments about proper procedures. Just a handful of people with tools and time, working together to make something better. It was simple, and it was everything the HOA had claimed to be, but never was. Still, not everyone found it easy to let go of the anger. I'd hear it in the conversations at the marina, in the sharp tones at the grocery store. People who'd been bullied the hardest, people who'd been humiliated or targeted, weren't ready to forgive. Some wanted lawsuits. Others wanted to see the former board members jailed for as long as the law would allow. I couldn't blame them. For years, those people had used fear as a weapon, and now that fear was gone, what replaced it was something harder to manage: righteous fury. But for me, the anger had burned out weeks ago, because standing on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the water move with the wind, I understood something that had taken me a long time to learn. Peace isn't about winning every battle. It's about knowing you didn't back down when it mattered, and I hadn't. The county eventually appointed an independent trustee to manage the HOA's remaining funds while the legal mess untangled itself. For the first time, the community's money was being used where it should have been all along: fixing the roads, maintaining the boat docks, clearing the overgrown walking trails. Neighbors who'd been strangers for years started organizing cleanup days, potlucks, and barbecues. The energy that had once been spent fighting each other under the board's thumb was finally being used to build something better. And slowly, the scars started to fade. But even in that peace, there were reminders. Sometimes I'd catch sight of the empty patch of gravel where the illegal office had stood, and remember the years of harassment, the endless letters, the fake patrols idling at my gate. Other times, I'd run into one of the former board members in town, head down, shoulders slumped, and I'd feel that old spark of anger flicker in my chest before I reminded myself it wasn't worth carrying anymore. The lake had given me back my quiet. That was enough. By late fall, the first court dates were scheduled. The news covered every hearing, every filing, every leaked detail of how deep the fraud went. For some, it was validation. For others, it was painful. Realizing just how long they'd been lied to, how much had been stolen from them. But for me, it was just noise. I'd done my part. The rest was up to the courts, the investigators, and the people who'd chosen to fight those battles. I stayed where I'd always been, on my porch, coffee steaming in the cool morning air, watching the lake and letting the quiet do its work. The neighbors, though, didn't forget. Sometimes they'd stop by with a pie or a fresh catch from the lake. Sometimes they'd just wave from the road, a silent thank you that didn't need words. I never wanted to be the hero of this story. I just wanted to be left alone. But standing there, watching the sun set behind the pines, painting the water gold, I realized something my grandfather had probably known all along. Sometimes, standing your ground isn't just about protecting what's yours. Sometimes, it's about reminding everyone else that they don't have to be afraid either, and that, more than anything, made every sleepless night, every letter, every confrontation worth it. By winter, the lake had changed. Not in the way the water lapped against the docks or how the morning fog rolled in low and heavy over the shoreline, but in the way people carried themselves. The weight that had hung over the community for years, the fear, the second-guessing, the constant worry of crossing some invisible line, was gone. In its place, there was something simpler, lighter. Neighbors waved when they passed, some of them still tentative, others with the easy familiarity that had been missing for too long. Kids played in the open without anyone snapping pictures to file violations. Couples took walks along the road at dusk without glancing nervously over their shoulders. It was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the one that had existed under the HOA's shadow. Back then, quiet had meant tension. Everybody keeping their heads down, trying not to draw attention. Now, quiet meant peace. And in that peace, I finally found what I'd been fighting for all along. The simple life my grandfather had built here. I'd gotten into a habit of walking the property lines every Saturday morning, just as he used to. The iron stakes were still there, marking the boundaries with the same quiet certainty they had for decades. I'd stop sometimes at the corner near the old office site, now nothing but a patch of bare gravel, and take a long breath. That spot had been the heart of their power, their symbol of control. Now it was nothing, just ground. Mine, as it had always been. It reminded me of something my grandfather once told me when I was a boy, sitting on the edge of the dock with our fishing poles dangling over the water. Land doesn't lie. People do. But the ground? It'll always tell you the truth if you know how to listen. Back then, I hadn't understood. Now, I did. Because in the end, it hadn't been their noise or their threats that won them those years of power. It had been silence. The silence of good people who thought they couldn't fight back, who thought the ground beneath their feet belonged to someone else just because a letterhead said so. But when the truth finally came out, the lake didn't hesitate to take that silence back. By spring, the legal battles were winding down. The courts had handed out their sentences, some fines, some probation, and for the worst offenders, real jail time. The old board members were ghosts in the community now, their houses up for sale, their cars no longer seen parked at the marina or the grocery store. Some people celebrated their downfall. Others pitied them. I didn't feel much of anything at all. Because for me, the victory had never been about seeing anyone in cuffs or hearing a judge read a verdict. It had been about something quieter, something steadier, standing my ground and proving, if only to myself, that I wouldn't be bullied off land that had been in my family for generations. And now, finally, I could live the way my grandfather had meant this place to be lived in. Simply, quietly, on my own terms. Neighbors started stopping by more often, not to gossip or complain, but just to talk. Some brought pies, others coffee, and one even brought an old photo album of the lake from decades ago, when the only things here were trees, water, and a handful of cabins scattered along the shoreline. We'd sit on my porch in the evenings, watching the sun sink low and the sky turn to fire over the water, and talk about the way things used to be, and the way they could be again. And slowly, the lake began to heal. One Saturday, I walked down to the marina and saw a group of neighbors rebuilding the dock that had been left to rot for years. There were no committees, no approval forms, no rules about acceptable materials or authorized hours. Just people with hammers and lumber, working together to fix something that had always belonged to all of us. I stood there for a while, hands in my pockets, and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Pride, not in myself, but in the quiet resilience of the people who had been here all along, just waiting for the chance to take their community back. By summer, there were barbecues again, potlucks at the park, kids splashing in the shallows without anyone taking photos to file complaints. The lake had found its rhythm again, the one it had before the board turned it into their little kingdom. And me? I settled back into the life I'd been chasing for years, without even realizing it. Mornings started with coffee on the porch, the mist curling low over the water. Afternoons were for tending to the cabin, patching up the dock, sanding the porch rails, keeping everything in the kind of shape my grandfather would have expected. Evenings were quiet, spent with a book in hand or a fishing pole in the water, watching the sun melt into the lake. Sometimes I'd catch myself thinking about the fight, about the letters, the fake cops, the endless nights wondering what they'd try next. And when I did, I'd feel that old anger stir, sharp and bitter, like a spark on dry grass. But then I'd look around at what was here now, the peace, the quiet, the neighbors who had found their courage again, and the spark would fade. Because if there's one thing this whole ordeal taught me, it's that some fights are worth the cost. Not because they make you a hero, not because they win you applause, but because they give you back the life you were supposed to have all along. And as I watched the lake shimmer under the evening sun, I realized something else, too. The story wasn't really about me. It was about the lake, about the people who lived here, worked here, raised their families here, about the quiet strength of a community that, once it remembered its voice, couldn't be silenced again. The land had told me the truth, and now, finally, the people had listened. Sometimes a neighbor will stop by and ask if I regret it, if I wish I'd just signed their papers years ago and avoided the fight altogether. I always give the same answer: no, because peace built on fear isn't peace at all. And as I stand on my porch in the soft light of evening, the water calm and still, the air carrying the scent of pine and fresh rain, I know one thing for certain: I'd do it all over again. Every letter, every late-night knock on the door, every stare from the fake patrols parked by my gate. Because in the end, the lake was worth it. And as the years stretch out ahead, quiet and steady, I know that long after the old board is forgotten and the last of their lies has faded, the water will still be here. The pines will still sway in the evening breeze. The porch will still creak under my boots as I step out with my coffee in hand. And the ground, the same ground my grandfather staked out so many decades ago, will still be mine. Not because a piece of paper says so, but because I never let anyone take it away. And that, more than anything, is the truth this lake will carry long after I'm gone.